Welcome to this comprehensive exploration of Chinese aviation during the Second World War. When we discuss aerial warfare in World War II, conversations typically center on the legendary Spitfires and Hurricanes of the Royal Air Force, the rugged American Mustangs and Thunderbolts, or the formidable Japanese Zeros. Yet the story of Chinese air power during this global conflict remains largely untold in the Western world. Today, we will journey through the fascinating history of Chinese aircraft during World War II, a tale of courage, international cooperation, and desperate struggle against a technologically superior enemy. China's war began on July 7, 1937, when Japanese forces launched a full-scale invasion following years of incremental aggression. The Chinese Air Force, known as the Nationalist Chinese Air Force, or Zhonghua Mingguo Kongjun, found itself facing the experienced and well-equipped Imperial Japanese Army Air Service and Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service. Like its armored forces, China possessed virtually no domestic aircraft manufacturing capability and depended entirely on foreign purchases, donations, and later, Allied assistance. This created an incredibly diverse fleet of aircraft from multiple nations, each with its own strengths, weaknesses, and logistical challenges. The Chinese Air War can be broadly divided into several phases. The early period from 1937 to 1940 saw Chinese forces fighting desperately with pre-war equipment, primarily American and Italian aircraft. The middle period from 1940 to 1942 witnessed the arrival of Soviet Yuanzhou in the famous American volunteer group, the Flying Tigers. The final period from 1942 to 1945 saw increased American involvement and the gradual modernization of Chinese air power. Throughout all these phases, Chinese and Allied pilots displayed extraordinary courage and skill, often flying obsolete aircraft against superior opponents. Let us begin our examination of Chinese aircraft with the American-built planes that formed the backbone of early Chinese air power. Curtiss Hawk II. The Curtiss Hawk II was one of the most important fighters in Chinese service during the early war years. This single-seat biplane fighter, purchased in the early 1930s, represented American export aviation technology of the interwar period. Powered by a Wright Cyclone radial engine producing approximately 700 horsepower, the Hawk II could reach speeds of around 300 kilometers per hour. It was armed with two 30-caliber machine guns mounted in the nose, firing through the propeller arc. The Hawk II featured an open cockpit and fixed landing gear, characteristics typical of its era. Chinese pilots appreciated the aircraft's sturdy construction and good maneuverability, though by 1937 it was already becoming obsolete. These aircraft saw extensive action in the early battles over Shanghai and Nanjing, where Chinese pilots fought valiantly despite being outnumbered and outclassed by more modern Japanese fighters. The Hawk II's biplane configuration made it highly maneuverable in dogfights, allowing skilled Chinese pilots to occasionally score victories against faster monoplane opponents. However, losses were heavy, and by 1938, surviving Hawk IIs were relegated to training duties as more modern aircraft became available. Curtiss Hawk III. The Curtiss Hawk III represented an evolution of the Hawk II design and was the last biplane fighter purchased by China in significant numbers. Introduced into Chinese service in the mid-1930s, the Hawk III featured a more powerful engine, producing around 750 horsepower, which gave it a top speed of approximately 385 kilometers per hour. This made it significantly faster than its predecessor. The Hawk III retained the two machine gun armament, but featured improved construction and slightly better performance overall. The aircraft maintained the open cockpit and fixed landing gear of earlier designs. Chinese Hawk IIIs saw extensive combat during the Battle of Shanghai in 1937 and the subsequent defense of Nanjing. These aircraft formed the core of several Chinese fighter squadrons and were flown by some of China's most skilled pilots. The Hawk III could hold its own against early Japanese aircraft, but struggled against the newer types that appeared as the war progressed. Notable Chinese aces scored multiple victories flying the Hawk III, demonstrating that pilot skill could partially compensate for aircraft limitations. By 1939, the surviving Hawk IIIs were increasingly used for ground attack missions and training, as they could no longer compete effectively with modern Japanese fighters. Northrop Gamma 2E. The Northrop Gamma 2E was a light bomber and reconnaissance aircraft that served with Chinese forces in the early war period. This single-engine monoplane represented a significant technological advance over biplane designs, featuring an all-metal construction, retractable landing gear, and an enclosed cockpit. Powered by a Wright Cyclone engine producing approximately 735 horsepower, the Gamma 2E could reach speeds around 355 kilometers per hour. It could carry a bomb load of up to 500 kilograms and was typically armed with 3 machine guns for defense. China purchased a small number of these aircraft in the mid-1930s, and they saw service primarily in reconnaissance and light bombing roles. The Gamma 2E's speed and range made it useful for deep penetration missions into Japanese-held territory. However, its light bomb load limited its effectiveness as a bomber, and its defensive armament proved inadequate against determined fighter attacks. Several Gamma 2Es were lost to Japanese fighters in anti-aircraft fire during the early campaigns. The survivors continued serving in secondary roles until replaced by more capable aircraft. Douglas O-2MC. The Douglas O-2MC was an observation and light attack biplane that served with Chinese forces in limited numbers. This two-seat aircraft was designed for reconnaissance, artillery spotting, and light ground attack missions. Powered by a Liberty engine producing around 420 horsepower, the O-2MC was relatively slow, with a maximum speed of approximately 240 kilometers per hour. It was armed with 2 to 3 machine guns and could carry a small bomb load. The aircraft featured an open cockpit for both crew members and fixed landing gear. Chinese O-2MCs served primarily in reconnaissance roles, gathering intelligence on Japanese troop movements and positions. Their slow speed and limited armament made them vulnerable to enemy fighters, restricting their operations to areas where Chinese fighters could provide escort or where Japanese air activity was limited. Despite these limitations, the O-2MC provided valuable service in the early war years when China desperately needed any available aircraft. Boeing 281 P-26 Peashooter export version. The Boeing 281, an export version of the famous P-26 Peashooter, represented one of the more modern fighters available to China in the early war period. This small monoplane fighter was revolutionary for its time, being one of the first all-metal monoplane fighters with an enclosed cockpit option, though Chinese versions typically had open cockpits. Powered by a Pratt & Whitney radial engine producing 600 horsepower, the Boeing 281 could reach speeds of approximately 377 kilometers per hour. It was armed with 2 30 caliber or 50 caliber machine guns. The aircraft featured fixed landing gear with distinctive streamlined fairings. China purchased approximately 11 of these aircraft in the mid-1930s. The Boeing 281 was fast for its era and reasonably maneuverable, making it competitive with early Japanese fighters. Chinese pilots flying the Boeing 281 scored several victories in combat, though the aircraft's light armament and lack of armor protection made it vulnerable. The fixed landing gear created significant drag, limiting performance compared to contemporary designs with retractable gear. By 1938, most surviving Boeing 281s had been lost to combat or accidents, though they had provided valuable service during the crucial early months of the war. Curtiss P-40 Warhawk, multiple variants. The Curtiss P-40 Warhawk deserves special attention as it became synonymous with Chinese and American air operations over China. This single-seat fighter represented a massive leap in capability over the biplane fighters that had equipped Chinese forces earlier. The P-40 came in multiple variants, with the early P-40B and P-40C models arriving first, followed by improved P-40E, P-40K, P-40M, and P-40N versions as the war progressed. The P-40 was powered by an Allison liquid-cooled engine, producing between 150 and 360 horsepower, depending on the variant. Top speeds range from 560 to 608 kilometers per hour. Early versions were armed with 2 50 caliber and 4 30 caliber machine guns, while later variants carried 6 50 caliber machine guns, providing formidable firepower. The P-40 featured all-metal construction, retractable landing gear, and an enclosed cockpit. The aircraft's distinctive shark-mouth nose art, made famous by the Flying Tigers, became an iconic image of the China-Burma-India theater. The P-40 arrived in China in late 1941 with the American volunteer group, the legendary Flying Tigers led by Claire Chennault. These volunteers, flying P-40Bs and P-40Cs, achieved remarkable success against Japanese aircraft using hit-and-run tactics that exploited the P-40's strengths. Excellent diving speed, heavy armament, and rugged construction. The P-40 could not turn with Japanese fighters like the Zero, but it could outdive them and absorb tremendous battle damage. After the Flying Tigers were absorbed into the U.S. Army Air Forces as the China Air Task Force, and later the 14th Air Force, P-40s continued serving as the primary American and Chinese fighter in the theater. Chinese pilots were trained on P-40s and flew them with distinction in the Chinese-American composite wing. The P-40N, the final and most numerous variant in Chinese service, featured reduced weight and improved performance. Despite being considered obsolete by 1944 standards in other theaters, the P-40 remained effective in China due to the generally lower performance of Japanese aircraft operating there. P-40s served in fighter, fighter-bomber, and ground attack roles throughout the war, compiling an impressive combat record. Douglas C-47 Skytrain, DC-3. The Douglas C-47 Skytrain, the military version of the legendary DC-3 airliner, was not a combat aircraft, but deserves recognition for its crucial role in Chinese operations. This twin-engine transport aircraft became the workhorse of aerial logistics in the China-Burma-India theater. Powered by two Pratt & Whitney radial engines producing 1 to 100 horsepower each, the C-47 could carry up to 28 troops or equivalent cargo at speeds around 370 kilometers per hour. The aircraft featured all-metal construction, retractable landing gear, and excellent reliability. C-47s flew the famous hump route over the Himalayas, supplying Chinese forces and American units in China after the Japanese cut the Burma Road. This was one of the most dangerous air routes in the world, with unpredictable weather, extreme altitudes, and Japanese fighter patrols claiming many aircraft. The C-47's ability to operate from primitive airstrips made it invaluable in China's challenging terrain. These aircraft transported troops, evacuated wounded, dropped supplies to isolated units, and even served as makeshift bombers when necessary. Chinese and American C-47 crews displayed extraordinary courage flying through treacherous conditions to maintain the vital supply line. Without the C-47, Chinese resistance in the later war years would have been impossible to sustain. North American B-25 Mitchell. The North American B-25 Mitchell medium bomber brought significant striking power to Chinese and American operations. This twin-engine bomber, famous for the Doolittle raid on Tokyo, served extensively in China from 1942 onward. Powered by two Wright Cyclone engines producing 1,700 horsepower each, the B-25 could reach speeds around 438 kilometers per hour. It carried a crew of 5 to 6 and could deliver a bomb load of up to 1,360 kilograms. The B-25 was heavily armed, with variants carrying up to 14 50-caliber machine guns, making it formidable against both air and ground targets. The aircraft featured all-metal construction, retractable landing gear, and excellent visibility for the crew. B-25s operated by the 14th Air Force and later by Chinese crews attacked Japanese shipping, airfields, supply depots, and troop concentrations throughout occupied China and beyond. The Mitchell's versatility allowed it to serve in multiple roles: level bombing, skip bombing against ships, ground attack, and even as a strafer with nose-mounted machine guns. Chinese B-25 units, trained by American advisors, conducted numerous successful missions against Japanese targets. The aircraft's rugged construction and reliable engines made it ideal for operations from China's primitive airfields. B-25s remained in Chinese service after the war, participating in the subsequent Civil War. Consolidated B-24 Liberator. The Consolidated B-24 Liberator heavy bomber operated in limited numbers from Chinese bases, though most missions originated from India. This four-engine bomber was one of the most produced American aircraft of World War II. Powered by four Pratt & Whitney radial engines producing 1 to 200 horsepower each, the B-24 could reach speeds around 467 kilometers per hour. It carried a crew of 10 and could deliver bomb loads up to 3,600 kilograms over long distances. The B-24 featured a distinctive high-mounted Davis wing that provided excellent lift and range. Armament typically consisted of 10 50-caliber machine guns in various turrets and positions. B-24s operating in support of Chinese operations conducted long-range strategic bombing missions against Japanese industrial targets, ports, and shipping. The aircraft's long range allowed it to strike targets throughout Japanese-occupied territory that were beyond the reach of medium bombers. However, the B-24 required lengthy concrete runways, limiting its ability to operate from most Chinese airfields. Most B-24 missions were therefore flown from bases in India, striking targets in support of Chinese ground operations. The Liberator's presence demonstrated the growing strength of Allied air power in the theater and the ability to carry the war to Japanese strongholds. Fiat CR-32. The Fiat CR-32 was an Italian biplane fighter that served with Chinese forces in significant numbers during the early war period. Italy sold approximately 24 of these aircraft to China in the mid-1930s. The CR-32 was considered one of the best biplane fighters of its era, featuring excellent maneuverability and sturdy construction. Powered by a Fiat radial engine producing 600 horsepower, the CR-32 could reach speeds around 375 kilometers per hour. It was armed with two 12.7mm Breda machine guns, providing good firepower for its time. The aircraft featured an open cockpit and fixed landing gear. Chinese pilots flying the CR-32 appreciated its agility and robust airframe. In the hands of skilled pilots, the CR-32 could compete effectively with Japanese fighters in turning dogfights. The aircraft saw extensive combat over Shanghai, Nanjing, and other battlefields in 1937 and 1938. However, as a biplane, it was inherently limited compared to monoplane designs. The fixed landing gear and open cockpit also represented technological disadvantages. By 1939, the surviving CR-32s were increasingly outclassed by newer Japanese monoplanes and were gradually withdrawn from frontline service. Breda BA-27. The Breda BA-27 was another Italian fighter that served with Chinese forces in limited numbers. This parasol-wing monoplane represented an attempt to combine the maneuverability of biplanes with the speed advantages of monoplane design. However, the result was not particularly successful. Powered by a Bristol Mercury radial engine, producing around 700 horsepower, the BA-27 could reach speeds of approximately 350 kilometers per hour. It was armed with two machine guns. The aircraft featured fixed landing gear and an open cockpit. China purchased a small number of BA-27s in the late 1930s, but they proved disappointing in service. The parasol wing configuration created significant drag, limiting performance, while not providing the expected maneuverability benefits. The BA-27 was also plagued by mechanical reliability issues. Most were quickly withdrawn from combat service after suffering heavy losses. The aircraft represents one of the less successful foreign purchases made by China in its desperate search for air power. Savoia Marchetti SM-81 Pipistrello. The Savoia Marchetti SM-81 Pipistrello, meaning bat in Italian, was a tri-motor bomber that served as one of China's primary bombing platforms in the early war years. This aircraft featured a distinctive three-engine configuration with one engine in the nose and one under each wing. Each engine produced approximately 700 horsepower, giving the SM-81 a cruising speed around 265 kilometers per hour. The aircraft could carry up to 2 tons of bombs and was armed with multiple machine guns for defense. It featured fixed landing gear and a spacious fuselage. China purchased a small number of SM-81s in the late 1930s. These bombers conducted raids against Japanese positions and airfields, though their slow speed and limited defensive armament made them vulnerable to fighters. The SM-881's three-engine configuration provided some redundancy, allowing the aircraft to return to base even with one engine damage. However, the obsolescent design and mechanical complexity made maintenance challenging. By 1940, most surviving SM-81s had been lost or were no longer operational due to lack of spare parts. Polikarpov I-15 biplane fighter. The Polikarpov I-15 was a Soviet biplane fighter that arrived in China as part of Soviet military assistance beginning in 1937. This aircraft featured a distinctive gull-wing upper-wing configuration that improved pilot visibility. Powered by a radial engine producing around 775 horsepower, the I-15 could reach speeds of approximately 370 kilometers per hour. It was armed with 4 7.62mm machine guns, providing good firepower. The aircraft featured an enclosed cockpit and fixed landing gear. The Soviet Union supplied substantial numbers of I-15s to China, and Soviet volunteer pilots flew many of them in combat alongside Chinese aviators. The I-15 was highly maneuverable and could hold its own in turning dogfights with Japanese fighters. However, as a biplane, it suffered from inherent speed limitations compared to monoplane designs. I-15 saw extensive action in 1937 and 1938, with Soviet and Chinese pilots scoring numerous victories. The aircraft's rugged construction and simple design made it relatively easy to maintain under field conditions. As newer aircraft arrived, I-15s were gradually relegated to ground attack and training roles. Some remained in service into the early 1940s, attacking Japanese ground targets with bombs and rockets. Polikarpov I-16 monoplane fighter. The Polikarpov I-16 was a revolutionary Soviet fighter that represented a massive leap forward for Chinese air power. This stubby monoplane fighter was one of the first production fighters with retractable landing gear and an enclosed cockpit. Powered by a radial engine producing between 750 and 100 horsepower, depending on variant, the I-16 could reach speeds from 440 to 525 kilometers per hour. It was armed with 2 to 4 machine guns, or a combination of machine guns and cannons. The I-16 featured all-metal construction and advanced aerodynamics for its time. The Soviet Union supplied hundreds of I-16s to China in various models, and Soviet volunteer pilots flew them extensively. The I-16 was fast, well-armed, and reasonably maneuverable, making it competitive with Japanese fighters of the late 1930s. Chinese and Soviet pilots flying I-16s achieved considerable success in combat, evening the odds against Japanese air superiority. The aircraft's main weaknesses were limited range, poor visibility from the cockpit, and tricky handling characteristics that required skilled pilots. I-16s remained in frontline service until 1941, when they were gradually replaced by more modern types. However, they continued serving in secondary roles throughout the war. The I-16 represented the backbone of effective Chinese fighter resistance during the crucial middle years of the conflict. Tupolev SB-2 bomber. The Tupolev SB-2 was a Soviet twin-engine bomber that provided China with a modern bombing capability for the first time. This sleek monoplane bomber was very advanced for its era, featuring all-metal construction, retractable landing gear, and enclosed crew positions. Powered by 2 radial engines producing around 960 horsepower each, the SB-2 could reach impressive speeds of up to 450 kilometers per hour, making it faster than many contemporary fighters. It carried a crew of 3 and could deliver bomb loads up to 1,500 kilograms. Defensive armament consisted of 4 machine guns. The Soviet Union supplied significant numbers of SB-2s to China, and Soviet crews initially flew most of them. The SB-2's speed often allowed it to outrun Japanese fighters, enabling successful bombing missions deep into enemy territory. Chinese and Soviet SB-2s attacked Japanese airfields, supply depots, and even targets in Taiwan and mainland Japan. However, the aircraft's light defensive armament made it vulnerable if intercepted by fighters, and losses mounted over time. As Japanese air defenses improved and newer, faster Japanese fighters appeared, the SB-2 became increasingly vulnerable. By 1941, surviving SB-2s were being replaced by more modern American bombers, though some continued serving in training and transport roles. Ilyushin DB-3 bomber. The Ilyushin DB-3 was a Soviet long-range bomber that operated in limited numbers with Chinese and Soviet volunteer units. This twin-engine aircraft was designed for strategic bombing missions requiring extended range. Powered by 2 radial engines producing around 950 horsepower each, the DB-3 could reach speeds around 430 kilometers per hour. It carried a crew of 4 and could deliver bomb loads up to 2,500 kilograms over considerable distances. The aircraft featured all-metal construction and good defensive armament. DB-3s conducted long-range strikes against Japanese targets, including raids on Taiwan and mainland Japan launched from Chinese bases. These missions demonstrated that Japanese home territory was vulnerable to air attack, providing an important morale boost to Chinese forces. However, the long-range missions required careful planning and often pushed aircraft and crews to their limits. The DB-3's range advantage came at the cost of reduced speed and maneuverability, making it vulnerable to fighter interception. Only a small number of DB-3s served in China, and most were operated by Soviet volunteer crews rather than Chinese pilots. Republic P-43 Lancer. The Republic P-43 Lancer was an American fighter that served in limited numbers with Chinese forces. This single-engine monoplane was essentially a predecessor to the famous P-47 Thunderbolt. Powered by a Pratt & Whitney radial engine producing 1,200 horsepower, the P-43 could reach to speeds around 563 kilometers per hour. It was armed with 4.50 caliber machine guns and featured all-metal construction, retractable landing gear, and an enclosed cockpit. The P-43 also had a turbocharged engine, giving it good high-altitude performance. The United States provided approximately 100 P-43s to China under Lend-Lease. However, the aircraft arrived with significant limitations. The turbocharger system was complex and difficult to maintain under field conditions, and many were disabled. The armament was considered light by 1942 standards, and the aircraft lacked armor protection for the pilot and self-sealing fuel tanks. Despite these shortcomings, P-43s served with Chinese squadrons, primarily in reconnaissance and ground attack roles, where their speed provided some protection. Chinese pilots flying P-43s scored occasional victories against Japanese aircraft, but the type was generally outclassed by more modern fighters. By 1944, surviving P-43s had been replaced by better aircraft. North American P-51 Mustang. The North American P-51 Mustang, one of the finest fighters of World War II, operated primarily with American units in China, but also equipped some Chinese squadrons in the final year of the war. This legendary fighter featured a laminar flow wing and streamlined design that produced exceptional performance. Powered by a Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin engine producing 1,695 horsepower, the P-51D variant could reach speeds of 703 kilometers per hour. It was armed with 650 caliber machine guns and could carry bombs or rockets for ground attack. The P-51 featured all-metal construction, retractable landing gear, an enclosed bubble canopy providing excellent visibility and long range that exceeded most other fighters. P-51s arrived in China in 1944 and immediately demonstrated their superiority over Japanese fighters. American P-51 pilots of the 14th Air Force achieved numerous victories, and the few Chinese units that received Mustangs found them to be exceptional aircraft. The P-51's long range allowed it to escort bombers deep into Japanese territory and conduct fighter sweeps over areas previously safe from air attack. The combination of speed, firepower, range, and maneuverability made the P-51 virtually unbeatable in the hands of a competent pilot. However, China received relatively few Mustangs before the war ended, as priority went to European and Pacific theaters. Those that did serve in China proved decisive in achieving air superiority in the final campaigns. Lockheed P-38 Lightning. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning, with its distinctive twin-boom design, operated primarily with American units in China. This unique twin-engine fighter was powered by two Allison engines producing 1,475 horsepower each, giving it a top speed around 667 kilometers per hour. It was heavily armed with one 20mm cannon and four 50 caliber machine guns concentrated in the nose, providing devastating firepower with no convergence issues. The P-38 featured tricycle landing gear, two counter-rotating propellers that eliminated torque effects, and twin-tail booms housing the engines and turbochargers. The central nacelle contained the cockpit and armament. P-38 served with the 14th Air Force in China, conducting fighter sweeps, bomber escort, and ground attack missions. The aircraft's long range and heavy firepower made it effective in the vast Chinese theater. However, the P-38's complexity made it difficult to maintain under field conditions, and engine problems were common in the tropical climate. American pilots flying P-38s in China scored numerous victories, and the aircraft's distinctive silhouette became well known to both friend and foe. Chinese forces did not directly operate P-38s during the war, though some Chinese pilots received training on the type. Northrop P-61 Black Widow. The Northrop P-61 Black Widow was a specialized night fighter that operated in very limited numbers in China. This large twin-engine aircraft was specifically designed for night interception using airborne radar. Powered by two Pratt & Whitney radial engines producing 2,250 horsepower each, the P-61 could reach speeds around 589 kilometers per hour despite its size. It was heavily armed with four 20mm cannons and four 50 caliber machine guns in a remote-controlled dorsal turret. The aircraft carried a crew of three: pilot, radar operator, and gunner. The P-61 featured all-metal construction, tricycle landing gear, and advanced avionics, including the SCR-720 airborne interception radar. A few P-61s served with American units in China, conducting night patrols against Japanese bombers. The aircraft's radar allowed it to locate and intercept enemy aircraft in complete darkness, a capability that gave Allied forces a significant advantage. However, the P-61's complexity and specialized role meant it saw limited use in China. Most night defense missions were still conducted by conventional fighters flying visual patrols. The Black Widow represented the cutting edge of aviation technology, foreshadowing the specialized interceptors of the post-war era. The story of Chinese aircraft in World War II is ultimately one of resilience and adaptation. China began the war with a small collection of obsolete aircraft and ended it operating some of the most advanced fighters and bombers of the era. This transformation was only possible through massive foreign assistance, first from the Soviet Union and later from the United States. The courage of Chinese pilots, who often flew inferior aircraft against better-equipped opponents, cannot be overstated. They faced not only the enemy, but also inadequate training, poor maintenance support, and the psychological burden of knowing that each aircraft lost might not be replaced. The American volunteer group, the Flying Tigers, deserves special recognition for their crucial role in Chinese air operations. These volunteer pilots, flying under the Chinese flag before America's official entry into the war, achieved remarkable success and provided a model for effective fighter tactics against Japanese aircraft. Their example inspired Chinese pilots and demonstrated that Japanese air superiority was not inevitable. When the Flying Tigers were absorbed into the U.S. Army Air Forces, they continued their support of Chinese operations as part of the China Air Task Force and later the 14th Air Force under the continued leadership of Claire Chennault. Soviet assistance in the early war years kept Chinese air resistance alive when it might otherwise have collapsed. Soviet volunteer pilots, flying alongside Chinese aviators, provided both material support and crucial combat experience. The Soviet I-16 and SB-2 gave China a fighting chance during the critical years of 1937 to 1941. This assistance came at significant cost, with many Soviet pilots dying in Chinese skies far from home. The evolution of Chinese air power mirrored the broader arc of World War II. From desperate defense with obsolete equipment, through grinding attrition in the middle years, to eventual superiority with modern American aircraft, Chinese aviation traced the path from desperation to victory. The experience gained during these years laid the foundation for post-war Chinese air power, training a generation of pilots and maintainers who would shape Chinese aviation for decades to come. The legacy of Chinese aviators in World War II deserves greater recognition in the broader narrative of the war. These pilots and their foreign allies fought in one of the most challenging theaters of the conflict, operating under primitive conditions against a skilled and determined enemy. Their victories were hard-won, their losses grievous, and their contribution to the ultimate Allied victory significant. The diverse collection of aircraft that served in Chinese skies, from obsolete biplanes to cutting-edge Mustangs, tells the story of China's long and difficult journey through World War II. It is a story of courage, sacrifice, and the gradual accumulation of strength that eventually helped defeat Japanese militarism. Thank you for joining us on this comprehensive exploration of Chinese aircraft in World War II.